Okay, so where we left off is page 43 and 44. And I'm just going to go through some of my favorite things that stuck out to me from this book and also just some thoughts that I have around it. So, 43 and 44, obviously, the heading is Racism is about white supremacy, period. Um, and I'll read some of the things that I highlighted right below that. People often view racism as a social division based on race, but this understanding, going down a little bit more, this understanding reduces racism to the level of effect in interpersonal relationships. Racism occurs because of how we as individuals feel about other ethnic groups, and then reconciliation occurs when we eliminate our negative feelings about other racial groups and establish relationships across race. That's what most people think, but that's not the correct way to establish racial reconciliation. She goes on to say that racism is an interlocking system of oppression that is designed to promote and maintain white supremacy. The notion that white people, including their bodies, aesthetics, beliefs, values, customs, and culture, are inherently superior to all other races and therefore should wield dominion over the rest of creation, including other people groups, the animal kingdom, and the earth itself. And for me, when I was going through this book with Chase and Chris, the two guys, white men that I pastor with at Kaleo Phoenix, if you didn't know, kaleophoenix.com for more info about that. But when I was reading this with them, um, one of the key points that I just realized as we were talking and having a conversation about all this together is that for me, as a Black female in mostly white spaces for most of my life, whiteness was like a subconscious desire and goal that I was always trying to achieve. As Black people or people of color, specifically my personal experience, it's like I do that because I'm told to do it, because I'm formed to desire whiteness. That's what white supremacy does, because if you desire it, then you won't destroy it or you won't call it out. But also, if you call it out, you become like this threat. And white supremacy will go to endless measures to protect itself. And so for me, this whiteness became such a subconscious desire because even the churches that I worked at previous to the one I'm at right now, it was never taught, but it was in the culture so much ingrained in the bodies of the ones leading the congregation that even indirectly it was taught to desire whiteness, to talk white, to dress white, to want whiteness because that was a way and form of protection. And it was what's hard though is when it becomes infused into the culture of Christianity that then you start to see Jesus and the savior that is saving you as also white. So then like what do you do with that? And those are some of the things that I was talking about with Chris and Chase. That's just interesting because I don't have an answer for that except to dismantle white supremacy and continue to call it out and to name the thing and to deconstruct the thing so that health can actually exist. But it's like it's just a hard thing to realize is when your religion or your belief system is being formed by the thing and the thing being white supremacy, what do you actually do with that? I mean, that is one question that I would often ask myself subconsciously or consciously as a Black female going into a white space. Who holds the power in this room, and how can I make them feel not threatened by me? Meaning, how can I stroke their ego? How can I make them feel powerful? How can I make them feel supported by me? Because that's the only way that I'm going to feel safe, physically, emotionally, mentally in this room is if I make them feel like I recognize that they have the power and they're the ones making the decision. So that's just a little bit of story too. I'm just throwing in experiences that I've had when it comes to white supremacy. There is when whiteness destroys Black bodies, it's because it's trying to protect itself. And I think I may have said this with my sister last time is that anger is a protective mechanism, a defense mechanism, and that you're trying to protect and defend something that's of value to you. So when white people become so angry to the point of death, it's because they are trying to protect their whiteness. They're trying to protect their money. They're trying to protect their power. They're trying to protect their influence. And so whiteness, because of white supremacy, at all costs will do anything and everything to protect itself. So it's a powerful, powerful realization that I'm super thankful that Dr. Chanequa Walker Barnes goes into. Um, Man, she even says on 44, racism upholds white supremacy through its use of power. So that's what it does. It uses its power to uphold itself and to dominate other cultures and other people groups. But on page 51, okay, I really like this section because she talks about the four pillars of white supremacy, and the supportive structures that maintain white supremacy. She talks about slavery and capitalism, genocide, capitalism, and Orientalism and war. Um, and one thing I appreciate about this is that the truth about my experience too is even before I started learning all of this stuff, without realizing it, me as a Black woman of color would also uphold the pillars of white supremacy, because unless the truth is being said and talked about, more than likely people of color are assimilating and upholding these things, even though it's the very thing that's oppressing them and their people and their culture. And so that's again why it's so important to tell the truth, because it gives opportunity for liberation and starts the whole process of liberation. But the first pillar of white supremacy that she talks about is commodification, which is the control and exploitation of people's labor. In most spaces, especially white Christian spaces, for me personally, my talent and gifts were deemed to be free. Um, I just can't tell you how many times, especially where I was, just getting paid pennies. One, because it was ministry, and I think ministry has this like label of you're not getting paid much anyway, which in most spaces, I guess that's true. I don't think that that's necessarily right, but it can be true, and it just depends on the budget and all those types of things. Um, but within ministry as well, I do believe in where I was as a Black person in a white space. One, excuse me, you have to work harder than most anyway. So I found myself doing ridiculous things, such as like going to the Apple store at 2 or 3 in the morning because my pastor wanted the iPhone or the latest device because that's just what he wanted, or me finding myself willingly running errands to pick up cleaner clothes and watch people's children. And we'll get into mammification in here, which is interesting, but until I read it in here too, I didn't know what it was or what it was called. um, but it was always, I almost like in hindsight felt that I would always go above and beyond. One, because I had to as a Black female in a white space, but two, because I would do it, it was exploited. Looking back on it, it was like, let me just take advantage of the fact that Erin's gonna go above and beyond, that Erin's gonna work till all hours of the night, that Erin's gonna give her life to this space because she has to survive, and then things are promised to me that didn't ever happen. It just was, in hindsight, again, well, this book is so liberating, freeing because it gives language to a lot of my experiences. So I can definitely say that commodification, the control and exploitation of people's labor, especially in Christian white spaces, that's what my experience was. Um, hmm, she says in here, the pillar of white supremacy views Blackness as inherently slaveable, as nothing more than property. And even in a Christian space, if we're not careful, if we don't intentionally work to not make that true, to not say, oh, you're a person of color, so you can do the grunt work, oh, you're a person of color, so we can pay you pennies, and we know that we'll get more than that because you're a person of color. You have to intentionally subvert that, like turn that around and intentionally work at that, which is something that I feel like we're doing at Kaleo, is constantly having conversations about, okay, how are you feeling as a Black woman? Like, let me take the administrative weight on this, that, and the other, because what we're not going to do, what we're not going to do is commodify your Blackness just because you're a woman, one, and just because you're in a Black body as well. So, again, if you're in a space where you're trying to dismantle white supremacy, it's so important to just continue to have conversations about these things, in order to, if it's being talked about, then it's not being built up. And that's what I feel like. If it's being talked about, then it's being dismantled and it's not being built up. And that's one thing I would encourage in whatever space you're in and you're trying to dismantle white supremacy. The next pillar of white supremacy is extermination. Let me see. It's on page 55. Yeah. When white Western expansionism encounters people of color with coveted land resources, those peoples become targets for extermination. And again, whiteness will do whatever it takes to uphold itself. Whiteness will literally go to the death and exterminate people if it feels that it's being threatened, or has another group of people that have coveted land and resources. I'm also reading this book called, it's a book about Ida B. Wells. I think it's called, I want to say Progressive Justice or something Justice, a story about Ida B. Wells. I'm messing that part up. But in that book, there's a story about three of her best friends before she got on this journey of to being a truth teller and publicly talking about lynchings during her time, and kind of being known as that. Right before that happened, um, three of her best friends were lynched. And three of these friends were lynched because they owned a store, black men and women, I think. I don't know if it was male or female that owned the store, but they had owned a liquor store that was near a white owned liquor store. And because that white owned liquor store felt threatened that the black owned liquor store was taking um, resources from them, or people were going to them to buy instead of their white store, they lynched three black people, and the owners of that store, because they felt threatened. And what's important to realize too is this thing is still happening, whether exactly that scenario, because I wouldn't be surprised if that is still happening, but also subtly and subconsciously, right? Because even in church spaces, and I speak about church spaces because that's what I've been in most of my life, but if at all they feel threatened by you, then they will make sure that you don't speak, that you don't speak in front of the congregation, that you aren't put in a place where people could maybe admire you or want to listen to your voice or want to hear you because of the threat. And they will literally exterminate your position, exterminate your voice, exterminate your body, exterminate your ability to have influence, power, or resources, because that is a pillar of white supremacy. Third pillar, let me move on a little bit more quickly. Demonization. But some of the things that I highlighted on page 56. The logic is at work when the interests of white supremacy collide with racial ethnic groups that it cannot, at least not immediately, assimilate, commodify, or exterminate. These groups, typically Middle Eastern and Asian cultures and nations, are consequently labeled as dangerous. Demonization is the operating principle and undergirding Smith's third pillar, Orientalism and war. 57, demonization is often employed to justify war and to destabilize attempts at peacemaking. Man, so these pillars, what I appreciate about these pillars too, is that they name why white supremacy protects itself. Um, if we make peace, then we can't have power, land, and resources. So let's demonize instead. But the fourth pillar, let's move on to that. The fourth pillar is indoctrination. I just love this whole section. A continuing struggle in anti-racist activism and organizing is the persistent refusal of many white, including honorary white allies, to recognize themselves as products of a white supremacist system. Man, people tend to think of racism as a set of behaviors that bad or sinful white people inflict against people of color. The implication of this is that good white people are not involved in this system. Here, we must return to Collins' conceptualization of this oppression as a system of power to which all people are connected in various degrees. In other words, no one is untouched by white supremacy. And it takes a lot of humility, especially if you're not Black or a person of color, to recognize I am being affected by white supremacy. If I'm not dismantling it, I'm upholding it. And even if I'm benefiting from it, it's still destructive if you don't call it out. It's just, I appreciate that she names that because we are all affected by white supremacy. Even if, I would even say, even if you're benefiting from it, it's destroying your soul. I had this dream one time. My God. Oh, this is interesting. And I don't share dreams very much, but I had this dream that I was having a conversation with this white male. He had blonde hair, blue eyes. He was the typical white male. This was back when I was first starting counseling, and a lot of different things were happening in the country. And in this dream, I was going at it with this young white male, and I was just speaking my mind, just telling him. I had all the language, all the verbiage to tell him the truth. And in the dream, I felt myself just like straightforwardly telling him the truth. And so after that, I left the room and he's just listening because he doesn't have really a comeback at all. And the next thing I know, in the dream, I'm walking down into this garage area that looks like Back to the Future with all these different types of cars. There's like lights under the cars. The cars are kind of floating, and it just literally felt like a scene from Back to the Future. And in this dream, the white male, blonde hair, blue eyes, tells me, "Hey, Erin, is this your car?" And he has this huge sledgehammer, and the car was blue, which, that's my favorite color. That's how I knew in the dream that it was mine. And he begins to smash it over and over and over and over and over again, and just destroy this property that I had in this garage. Then he has a friend that's in a car that's not too far from where mine was, and he has like brunette white man, like brown hair, blah blah blah. So he's in his car and he's just revving his engine over and over and over again, and I am watching this guy smash my car and watching this guy rev his engine, and I go right back up the steps, and I'm like, I'm not going to have any part of this. But what's interesting, in the dream, it continues. The white man winds up taking this white girl, and I learned this in counseling too, is that sometimes, like, your brain intentionally will show you things as it wants you to see it. So in the dream, I knew that the white girl was me, but my brain wasn't letting me see that as myself. So this white girl then starts being literally beat up by this white man, and he just is like just destroying this woman, and beating her, and as he's beating her, little horns are coming out of his head, and he begins to have the appearance of a demon or a devil. And then he gets so angry that he then explodes, and just whoops, he explodes, and then he dies. And after that dream, I also had that dream. You're probably listening. If you're listening to this, you're probably like, "Whoa, that's crazy," right? But I had that dream. I think the night of, I had gone. Me and my sister and a couple friends, and my boyfriend as well. We went to a boat day, and when we were returning our boat, there was this huge white boat with a ton of white people on it, and they were leaving the dock and going into the water for a fun party, on their boat. And they're playing this music, like this rap music and all this other stuff. And as they're pulling away, the back of the boat, it reads literally white privilege. Literally is what the name of the boat, and this was like high Trump time and all that type of stuff. And I looked at that boat and I'm like, I cannot believe that they literally are not afraid at all to literally name their boat in public with black letters on a white boat, white privilege, while they are appropriating Black culture by dancing and having a good time to Black music. And I was angry, and I couldn't believe what was happening. And I think my brain was also processing that, but I also feel like, it was a picture of what white supremacy does, is that it destroys itself. At the end of the day, white supremacy destroys itself. It destroys other people, but it takes over. It takes over even your white body, and you will destroy yourself even in it. I kind of felt like it was a prophetic picture, so I keep that dream in mind as I continue to learn about all of these things. Um, so yeah, I just wanted to share that. So moving on to page 61, and then we're coming up to the end of chapter 1. This was a longer chapter. Um, But I like when she said that when she talks about classism, is that it promises greater opportunity, power, and wealth to those who conform, and it excludes those who do not. And this classism, this thing is the reason, again, it gives language to my experience why I would often assimilate and conform all the time because there was opportunity, power, and wealth if I conformed versus if I didn't. And that's that's what you'll see some people of color do, but also white people do the same, is that there's opportunity, power, and wealth to those who conform to the ideology of white supremacy versus those who do not. And then I like how she finishes off too, that context matters. In the context of an industry, towards the bottom of page 61, in the context of an industry where people of color are grossly underrepresented and misrepresented, casting a person of color in a white by default role could be subversive. On the other hand, casting a white person in one of the few roles made available for people of color is simply another iteration of white supremacy. I really like that she talks about that as well, about black people, people of color, especially in a context of just Hollywood and how Hollywood does things. That's my sister. She's leaving for work. You'll see her on Friday. Also, some notes that I are made here for myself too when talking about classism is that assimilation, we talked about assimilation, why people of color assimilate and why they may choose to assimilate and all of those things, is that I have to make a choice that it is more costly for me to chase justice if I'm solely thinking about myself and my well-being than it is to go against the grain and fight for what's right. Because if I'm thinking about me as an individual, it's more costly to chase justice than to speak truth and to call out white supremacy than it is to go against the grain and to be a truth teller like Ida B. Wells or Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X and all these other civil rights justice mystic activists and all of those things. But at the same time, I would also argue that it might feel like it's more costly, but I think it's more costly not to, because because when we're not dismantling it, we're building it. When we're not dismantling it, we're upholding it, and we're letting that power structure continue to destroy Black, Indigenous people of color as well as white people. It destroys all people involved. Man. And she says this. Does she say it here? Yeah. She says, it cannot be overstated. Middle of page 61. It cannot be overstated. Racism is about white supremacy and the complex interlocking forms of power that maintain it. I would also say this too, as I was talking with Obani Ukuku, who's coaching me through building out a justice arm for Kaleo Phoenix, but also has experience in being a justice attorney and all those things. She told me at first too, like, we're not having a conversation, especially in the church. We're not having a conversation about racial reconciliation unless we're having a conversation about white supremacy, because white supremacy is what racism is about, which is the thing that is oppressing people, but it's hard to talk about white supremacy, especially in white church spaces, because of white fragility, and and white rage, because if we talk about it, it's going to make people mad. We're going to lose money. It's going to, cause people in our church to leave. And, but what is it? What value do you have? And what are you trying to do? Because I can even think of another local pastor here who spoke out against racism. He didn't even necessarily, I haven't watched his video, but I guess he recorded this 10-minute video and talked about racism and kind of calling it out. But because of that 10-minute video, it's circled into the 5 or so different church campuses that he has. And before he made the video, his church and all the campuses together collectively was 3,000 people. After he talked about that, and after the video circulated and he talked and called out racism, his church has gone down to 800 people. So from 3,000 people to 800 people, meaning 2,200 people left because they didn't like that he talked about racism in his church. And this guy, he's the head of all of these campuses and all of that stuff, and just has a value of social and injustice and racial equality and all of those things. And so I kind of, when I heard that story, because Kendall, my boyfriend, was telling me about it because he had a meeting with him directly not too long ago. And I was like, dang, But then I was also thinking like, "Dang, but, like, do we want those people there anyway, though?" Like, I mean, I think it's good that they left, though. It's unfortunate, but it's also revealing that, hey, if these are the people that are making up my church, then, what values are we discipling our people in? And that goes for if you're a leader of a church, that goes if you're the leader of a book club, that goes for if you are a mom and you're parenting your children. That goes for if you're an aunt and you have nieces and nephews, if you're a coworker or colleague or what have you. What values are we instilling into the people that we're discipling and what values are forming? Because obviously justice and equality wasn't a value in those 2,200 people that left. Obviously, I pray too that maybe that begins the journey for them of learning and the journey of just recognizing what white supremacy is and what it does and what it means. Um, but again, until you tell the truth, that journey can't even happen. So be a truth teller, even if it means you lose. Even if it means you lose. And then we're getting into chapter 2. Racism is not a standalone issue. She talks a lot about in this next set of reading intersectionality. Um, yeah, and I appreciate that she names the fact because in my last working space, I felt that sometimes because we were taking care of women in general, that was where the journey of chasing justice stopped, and we weren't willing to take it steps further. And we were okay with just leaving it at that versus doing more specifically for Black and Brown people, such as giving Black and Brown people opportunities and enforcing that we will make space for Black and Brown people, whether they're qualified or unqualified, and all of those things. And I could go on a tangent about that. But again, that's what I appreciate about reading this book is that she calls out that women of color have a completely different experience than other white women. That although we are still being oppressed, we're still at a different intersection here when it comes to oppression. And that it's not about like who has the lowest experience. Like, not that that's part of the conversation, but if justice and equality is the goal, then we have to realize that every person who experiences oppression experiences at a different level. And so if we're going to see racial reconciliation, then we have to realize that we have to meet these people at different intersections. You're not going to be able to meet racial reconciliation. You're not going to be able to have that with a Black female at the same point that you have it with a white female. Then you're not going to be able to have it with a Black man at the same intersection that you have it with a Black woman. And you're not going to be able to have it with a Latino woman at the same exact intersection that you have it with a Black woman. Like, we all have different experiences, and we have to be aware of that, and we have to be willing to learn what those experiences are and what forms and ways oppression oppresses people at these intersections if we are going to see racial reconciliation the way that we want to see it. And so I just appreciated that she called that out, the specific thing that she said that I wrote here, but um, I don't know exactly what, I didn't write the page number down that she says it, but she says, when women of color are engaged in anti racist work with our male colleagues, we are often expected to assume race first, gender second mentality. That is, to effectually regulate the non raced layers of our identity to the background. Yeah, I love also that she talks about intersectionality. She says, I cannot separate my race. Oh, did she say this? I think I said this. I wrote this in the margins, actually. Yeah. When she starts talking about racial gender identity equals race plus gender plus race times gender on page 68, I wrote in the margins, I cannot separate my race from my womanhood, and I cannot separate my womanhood from my race. Yeah, and I think the biggest challenge I have, and just depending on who I'm talking with, or depending who I'm working with, or what have you, is they oftentimes try to group me into the bucket of oppression without realizing that contextually there's so many different layers of generational trauma and generational experiences and all of those things that are very different. So you just can't group us together, you know. And I can't separate those things. And then I want to read some parts on page 68. I like that she says, "There are unique experiences that are part of my Black womanness. This means that I am not only a target of racism and sexism, I am also a target of gendered racism and racialized sexism. Other layers of my identity, especially my class, sexuality, and nationality, further attenuate my experiences of oppression and privilege." Gosh, it's just so good. Let's just go through it and then I'll make some commentary about it. But top of page 70, if you're with me, the need to split one's political energies between two, sometimes oppressing groups is a dimension of intersectional disempowerment that men of color and white women seldom confront. Indeed, their specific race and gendered experiences, although intersectional, often define as well as confine the intersex of the entire group. The problem is not simply that both discourses fail women of color by not acknowledging the additional issue of race or patriarchy, but that the discourses are often inadequate discrete even to the discrete tasks of articulating the full dimensions of racism and sexism. Because women of color experience racism in ways not always the same as those experienced by men of color, and sexism in ways not always parallel to experiences of white women, anti racism and feminism are limited, even on their own terms. The failure of feminism to interrogate race means that the resistance strategies of feminism will often replicate and reinforce the subordination of people of color. And the failure of anti racism to interrogate patriarchy means that anti racism will frequently reproduce the subordination of women. How are we not making that happen? What are we doing to not allow that to happen? And again, I think the way that we do it is that we talk about it and we name the thing and we center the truth and we tell the truth so that we can build the value so that our lives are formed differently and we can begin to live differently. But the only way we can live differently is if we have different values, and the only way that we can have different values is if we begin to talk about these things, because that the communication, be it verbally or just in the way that we live, is forming people and discipling people. So I just appreciate that she called that out. Later on in that page, racism and sexism, after all, have the same ultimate aim: the preservation of white supremacist heteropatriarchy. What else? I mean, what else? What else can we say about that? Bottom of page 70 into page 71, white supremacy, which is the belief that white people are inherently superior to all other races, is in every respect, including their bodies, intellect, aesthetics, beliefs, values, behaviors, and customs. By design, white supremacy works by convincing all peoples, not just white people, of its truth. Yeah, for sure. And I think, again, that's the danger, especially in a white Christian context, a white evangelical space. If you are not naming this truth, if you are not dismantling it, if you are not verbally saying, we don't agree with white supremacy, and this is why, these things are being formed in you as a white pastor, being formed in you, also being formed in the people that you disciple, because these values that you have is the lens in which you also view the Bible and read the Bible, which is a whole nother conversation. Oh man, that just goes, it's so layered. And that's what we were talking about together with me, Chris and Chase, is that there's so many layers to this thing. And it's gonna be a lifetime and many lifetimes of dismantling it. But we have to keep talking about it and we have to keep doing the work and we have to keep learning together. When people of color internalize the view that whiteness is superior to all other races, including their own, we call this internalized oppression. And man, oh man, have I felt this. When I first read this, I just wrote in the margins here the whole page and started, because that's what I experienced and that's what I felt as a Black female working in a white dominated space, in previous work and experiences that I had where we weren't calling out white supremacy, where we believed that white supremacy wasn't even real, and that was a time of the past. I was internalizing my own blackness. It was teaching me to hate myself and to desire to be white and to rid myself of my culture and to not want to learn, to not want to be connected to people of color, to not want to understand the oppressive ways that white supremacy oppresses us, and to not want to understand the journey of liberation that we have to go through, and to not want to value racial healing and healing from racial trauma and all of those things. When you desire whiteness, you internalize oppression. And when I saw that word, that language, I was like, that's it. That's what I was doing. And that's how I felt. And I'm reading this other book called Subversive Sabbath by AJ something. I don't remember his last name, but it's so good. And in the book, he briefly mentions that when you name something, Adam and Eve, he was talking about when they had the job of naming something, they were given the job of naming, which also indicated that they had authority over something. So to name something indicates that you have authority over something, which is once again why you must be a truth teller. Why I must be a truth teller is because when I can name something like internalized oppression, I can name it, separate myself from it, name the thing, and then declare that I have authority over it and reclaim my identity and I always get those things tongue twisted. My dignity and identity, and to reclaim those things back by naming it. But when you can't name it, you continue to live in it and you don't know what's happening. That's even why counseling is so freeing and so therapeutic and so healing, is because you start to name the things that you're experiencing. You start to name the traumas that you're experiencing so that you can be free from it, so that you can take the next steps. But we start with naming it. We start with talking about it. So even if we carry that practice, man, this is coming alive to me even as I'm saying it to you. Even as if we carry that practice into daily life, if we carry the practice of naming and conversation, the therapeutic practice of conversation into daily life, imagine what type of healing we can bring. Imagine the beloved community that she talks about. MLK coined that and talks a lot about that, that we can build, and a healthy culture that we can build if we continue to have conversations about these things. But again, white supremacy continues to want us to stay silent and to not name these things, which is why, because if silence is what keeps us upholding the pillars of white supremacy and not being able to talk about it. But if you start naming it, you're like, wait a minute, what? Wait a minute, what are we doing? Again, I'll just say it because the more I say it, the more it helps me. So when you name it, you separate yourself from it. And one, you give people of color the opportunity to separate themselves from it and to claim their dignity and identity back. But when you also name something, you give the oppressors an opportunity to stop oppressing you. And you also give oppressors an opportunity to either to reveal who they are. Either I'm going to keep oppressing you or I'm not going to oppress you, because now we're talking about the thing. So man, there's so many layers and just interesting things about that, but I really appreciate that a lot. Um, Middle of page 71, Sheree Moraga consequently states that all members of oppressed groups must wrestle with this question: how have I internalized my own oppression in their journeys to liberation? And when I was answering that question in therapy and counseling and all those things, I was realizing that I just wasn't valuing myself. I wasn't valuing my identity. I wasn't valuing my blackness, wasn't valuing my black skin, wasn't valuing my black hair, my lips, my eyes, my body, right? So, what does it look like for me to reclaim those things? It looks like me surrounding myself with black beauty. It looks like me leaning into my culture and understanding why and where we come from, and why we come from those things, and why we do the things that we do, and finding people that express black joy and black beauty and reclaiming value to my black self. That is how I that is how I take the next step for me as I answered that question. That is how I took the next step in my journey to liberation and my continued journey in liberation. Um, Goes on to say, it is frightening to acknowledge that I have internalized a racism and classism. where the object of oppression is not only someone outside of my skin, but the someone inside my skin. I wrote here in the margins, how do you redeem someone who is internally oppressed when their redeemer teaches theology that upholds their oppression with the underlying value of white supremacy? And I wrote that down because that was my experience. I was being taught that my redeemer teaches oppressive theology, oppressive thoughts, meaning, and this is just one example, but if there was something that of injustice that happened, my pastor would say things like, "Well, you know, um, what was he doing, or what was she doing, or maybe she shouldn't have been doing this, that, or the other." Or once the black people started talking out or speaking out or getting angry, they would use scriptures like "turn the other cheek" to discourage you from using your voice and from being liberated. That's when you know it's toxic. It's like, my God. And so, if you want like a really good breakdown of that passage and what was really happening contextually when Jesus talks about turn the other cheek, if your brother slaps you, turn the other cheek. If he asks you to go a mile, go 2 miles. Chris Townley has a really good clip that I posted not too long ago. It's a white guy in a Kaepernick shirt. So if you go on my Instagram and scroll, he has a really good, I think like maybe a few minute, maybe 4 minute clip on explaining all of that. And when I saw that, I was like, man, Black people, get your dignity back, because we've been taught, again, we've been discipled by white men who value white supremacy. And so we're taught to stay oppressed. We're taught to be silent because our Redeemer is teaching us oppressive bit, like to be oppressed, because we've been discipled by people that see Jesus that way. Lord, what is happening? It's so important to have conversations about this stuff. Later on, page 71. The internalization of racism often means that people of color devalue our own bodies, our aesthetics, and our cultural and family values, norms, and beliefs. Um, Page 73. I highlighted middle of the page. Representation matters. Every detail of representation matters. Intersectionality calls attention to the ways in which even those who are oppressed by racism are often complicit with it. Yes. And I would say, that's why for me, like I stopped following certain people. Like sometimes as a black female, you just got too many white people. You got too many white people in your voice, in your feed. Even if they're for justice and equality, it's like I just need to see black people. Like there's enough, enough. Like sometimes that's how I feel. It's like there's too many white people. It's just too much. I just need to see people of color. I need black voices. I need black women. I need to be surrounded by that. Like that's why I'll watch. For me, it's a lot of fun to watch Married at First Sight, and then to watch Kev on Stage and his wife and their friends, that chick Angel and Marcus. Recap that series, because it's just black people talking like black people, having a good time recapping the show, and it makes me feel connected to my culture. And you got to find out what is that for you. How can you feel like you're seeing representation in the things that you're doing? How are you adjusting your feeds? What books are you reading, authors, by what authors, those types of things. And then for white people too, it's like realizing that, especially if you're trying to bring justice and equality to the spaces and places that you have influence, how are you making sure that you're bringing representation and other cultures and people are represented, and that their voices are heard and have the freedom to be spoken from in a place without oppression and without restriction, to represent themselves? My encouragement is like, let's let people of color represent their full self. Represent your full self. Be you 100%. Like, embrace your culture, embrace your rituals, embrace your practices. I want all of it. And I say that imagining and envisioning other cultures, indigenous people, Asians, Latinos. It's like like I want to love your culture as it is without changing it, and I want you to love your culture as it is without changing it. And that's one thing that white supremacy doesn't do. I'm going on little tangents here. Let's keep going. Yeah. Page 74, middle page 74, under gendering racism. To say that women and men of color experience differing forms of racism does not mean that either group is somehow more disadvantaged by racism than the other. Again, I appreciate that she named that because it's not like, let me one up you on who's the most oppressed here. It's just being aware enough to realize that the work that's needing to be done for women of color versus men of color is going to be different. So we need to approach the work differently. Middle page 75, the aim of describing gendered racism is not to produce a sort of oppression Olympics, kind of renaming what we just talked about, in which groups jockey for the position of the most marginalized. Rather, considering how different groups experience racism gives us a more comprehensive understanding of how racism operates. Page 77, top of that, intersectionality thus helps us to understand how our experiences of oppression vary based upon our complicated and multi-layered identities, and also points us to the fact that our understanding of what it means to seek liberation or to be radical also varies. That's so good because a Black woman who seeks liberation is going to look different than a Latino woman who seeks liberation, than a Latino man seeks liberation, than a white female seeks justice and equality, than a Black male seeks liberation, than an Asian male seeks liberation, than an Indigenous woman seeks liberation. It's going to look different. And our work, our radical work is also going to look different. And I think we just need to leave space for that and be aware of that. I also appreciate that she points out in the middle of page 77, the danger in using the women of color label is that it can obs, obfuscate, obfuscate the distinctions between the forms of oppression experienced by women of different racial ethnic identities and women of different hues. Very, very true. Very, very true. Um, Yeah, yeah, and then she goes into colorism and the politics of beauty. I've always, it's funny when I would say when I was younger, working in a white space, you just didn't want to be Black. Like I was perming my hair to get it straight so that I could look more like white women. I was doing my makeup certain ways. I was dressing a certain way because I was trying to be white, but also I wasn't as accepted, culturally speaking, as a mixed person or someone that had a lighter shade of skin. Because again, she talks about it in here, your proximity to whiteness determines your experience and access to privileges and resources and different things. So all of that matters, but especially for me being dark, my hair not being as curly, even pay attention if you would too to the Black people that they put in commercials and in movies. More oftentimes than not, they're putting lighter skinned, super curly hair women in the person of color space versus like a dark pigmented, deeper coursed hair, like those are the women that I identify with, that I appreciate when people leave them as they are. Like I even had a conversation, this is like a little tangent, but I had a conversation with Kendall last night about the weekend because the weekend did the Super Bowl, and Kendall was talking about how he misses the old weekend when he had locks and he was doing more R&B type music, and now he's doing more of like pop music. But I was telling Kendall I like his hair though because he didn't do anything to it. Like even though he's a man, it's just we began to talk about essentially this colorism, colorism's trinity: skin, hair, and body. When you just let Black people's hair be what it is, instead of trying to retexturize it so that it's acceptable based upon what culture is accepting, it's just like a whole thing. So that's something personally that I've definitely felt and experienced. And I need to wrap this up because I gotta go. But I want to get through some of this stuff. Nevertheless, the relationship, middle of page 81, nevertheless, the relationship between perceived skin tone and objective markers of social prestige is so strong that many scholars argue that skin tone is becoming more important than racial identity. I would agree with that. I totally would agree with that. Like even on Married at First Sight, and they talk about this, Kev on stage and their commentary about it, but this white woman wanted to marry a Black man. And Married at First Sight is about being married at first sight. You don't know who you're marrying, but these experts put you up together based upon what you say you're looking for, all this other stuff. So she wanted to marry a black man. She's like, I kind of want that black man that you don't really know quite what's in him, but you know he's got a little something and a little bit of flavor. And it's like, see, objectifying. I hate that. It's like I just want a little bit of black. Just a little bit of black, not too much black, just a little bit of black because I just like that. My sister and I talk about this in our Kendall does that, this little hand thing. I noticed that. But I talk about that with my sister in our new series called Interracial Chronicles. And her and I had a conversation first, and then I'm gonna be interviewing her and Stefan for a series for my podcast. So anyways, going on a little tangent there, but yeah, that I just say like that's so true. Top of page 82, the closer one's skin tone or skin color is to white, the closer one is to being treated with an elevated status, that of an honorary white person. Again, perfect language to what we just talked about. Um, Towards the middle of page 82, the upper levels of this new racial caste system may well include individual blacks who approximate white aesthetics and normative values. The irony later on in that page, the irony of this new pigmentocracy. Pigmentocracy. I love this. The irony of this new pigmentocracy is that it will reinforce the supremacy of whiteness even as the country becomes less white. Yeah, wow. Yeah. There's so many interracial relationships happening, especially in the country. I did a little research project on Gen Z for the Smithy Group, which is the company I used to work for. And we were doing that. It's by 2045, I believe, more than half of the country will be biracial, meaning, especially if you consider a biracial person black, if there's a black in you, there's black, just our numbers are going to shift. And so I just appreciate her calling out the irony of this pigmentocracy is that if we are not addressing it and realizing that colorism in and of itself is still a form of oppression, as the country becomes less white, white supremacy is still going to be operating as itself because it's valuing people based upon the shade of their skin because that is their proximity to whiteness. Yeah. Let me get through a couple more of these here. Um, so much easier to do this when I'm talking with my sister than it is by myself, but I appreciate you just hanging out with me. Yeah, I resonated with this too. Top of page 91, and then we'll stop here. Among African and American women, among African and African American women, much of the excitement over the film Black Panther had to do with the skin tones of the female characters. That is so, so, so true. There is not one movie that I have seen where so much dignity was given to dark, pigmented Black women. And I loved that about the film. All of whom, she goes on to say, all of whom were dark skinned and also depicted as beautiful, smart, and highly skilled rather than subservient, tragic, or evil, as happens so frequently. Yeah, and it's interesting to, as you learn these things, to begin to pay attention to movies and books and just different things that you're consuming and how people of color, especially for me as Black women, how are we being represented here? Like in this context, why is it that the Black female is that single mom who's on drugs, or she has to work 3 jobs? Or even I just watched Princess and the Frog the other day, and it's like, why did she have to become a frog, one, and remain a frog for most of the movie? Why can't we just see Black women be Black? And why can't we see Black people just be Black for the entire time? Why can't we just let people be Black, right? Same thing with Soul. I mean, I liked the movies, but still, it's like I still haven't seen Disney produce something where Black people are just Black the entire time instead of changing into something else. So many things. And then, yeah, I didn't like that. Also, in Princess and the Frog, if you even look at her family and what they were doing, it's like, why did she have to work 3 jobs and she had to save for the restaurant and her white friend had all this money, you know? It's like it's true, yes, but why can't we just see black people, like, rich? Why can't black people be the ones in power? Why can't black people be the decision makers? Why can't black people be the ones that are redeemed? You know what I mean? Like, why? Why? Like, all of those things. And then it also just makes me aware of that, 1, and 2, makes me want to make sure that I'm giving people the opportunity to be fully represented in the spaces and places that I have influence, especially as a Black female. Also working in the context of 2 white men is like constantly reminding them and us collectively as like, hey, representation is super important. We got to have our music, man. Like, appreciate the white folk, but like, I only want people of color because, that's one of the responsibilities that I have. That's why I'm saying it. It's like, we have to, we have to, we have to, we have to. And in every space that we even have volunteers, it's got to be shared leadership and it's got to be people of color represented. Like, we can't, oh, but they're talented. I don't care. I don't give a damn if they're talented. We need people of color. You know what I mean? So I appreciate that. Again, I'm super thankful that my introduction to this book was a white man saying, like, hey, I think if Erin's coming on, we should read this together. That's just redemptive in and of itself. And 2, I appreciate that we get to just process and learn together with this. So it's so different not being able to talk to somebody live, but I appreciate you guys bearing with me with this and going through all of this and, appreciate your patience and that I was a little bit behind. All right, guys, love you. I'll see you soon and God bless you. Have a great day. Love y'all, Patreon. Thank you for being Patreons. Thank you for supporting me. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to use my voice. Thank you for being humble enough to want to learn from me and with me alongside me. It means so much and appreciate y'all. Bye for now.